Good afternoon, countrymen and women. It has been a while since we last discussed a couple of pertinent national issues. And today it appears that we have this issue of debt restructuring, which I felt was necessary for us to actually discuss so that we can get to the bottom of what really debt restructuring is and what it means for our country, especially given the high number of people that are celebrating this debt restructuring agreement, which was ostensibly reached in France during one of the global finance meetings that are normally conducted on an annual basis. So, debt restructuring and what implications this debt restructuring agreement has for the nation. First of all, it is a well-known fact that as a country, we are indebted. We have been indebted since we got independence. As most of you might remember, there was a time during the tenure of President Levi Mwanawasa that we were fighting to have debt cancellation. At that time, our total external debt was standing at about $7 billion. And we went through the motion of involving a lot of advocacy groups, including the church. A lot of church mother bodies played a very cardinal role, especially the Roman Catholic Church. And we managed to have a cancellation of that debt through what was known as the Paris Agreement. And during Manawasa's tenure, we literally had zero external debt. But then, as things always happen, our national debt began to accumulate again. So by the time that the MMD was leaving office, the time that President Rupiah Banda was being defeated in 2011, November of 2011, our total external debt was standing at about $2.5 billion. So from the time that Mwanawasa managed to get total debt cancellation for us, where we were at zero, to the time that the MMD were leaving office and the Patriotic Front were taking over, the country had accumulated a total of about $2.5 billion in external debt. And then during the 10 years that the Patriotic Front were in office, they accumulated an additional 10 or so billion dollars. So the time that the UPND were taking over the country on the 24th of August 2021, our total external debt was standing at about $12 billion. And then the UPND as well have accumulated quite some debt. As we are speaking right now, the total external debt is actually standing at about $14.3 billion. So which means there has been an increment from the time that the UPND took over of about $2.3 billion in external debt. So basically that is the background of our external debt. Now, the president recently traveled to Paris to attend the global finance meeting. And he did announce to the nation yesterday that he had managed to secure a debt restructuring agreement. This debt restructuring agreement is something that has been talked about by the new Donald administration for quite some time now. And the purpose of this particular discussion is basically to zero in on that debt restructuring agreement and understand what it means for the common man, what it means for the nation, and what it means in terms of our global financial standing as far as our debt attractiveness is concerned. So, to start with, the debt restructuring agreement that was reached by the president yesterday is basically a framework agreement. In other words, it just lays down the principles of how debt restructuring is going to be undertaken for each of our debts. So when we are borrowing as a nation, we don't normally borrow at once. As we speak right now, we have more than 100 separate loan agreements. And the terms of each of those loan agreements is different. So when we talk about the terms of a loan agreement, we're talking about the amount which we would have borrowed. So there's an issue of the amount. there is the issue of the tenure of the loan. The tenure of the loan is essentially the period over which we are required to repay the loan. And then there is the interest rate. The interest rate is basically how much interest we would have to pay for the loan, and whether that interest is simple interest or it is actually compounded interest. So there's that aspect in a loan agreement. And then there's the repayment or the installment plan in that loan agreement. So some loans, you'll find that there is no installments that have to be paid, but we just need to pay off the entire amount after maybe a year or after 2 years or after 3 years. That is basically the installment structure of that particular loan. So when we talk about debt restructuring, we are basically talking about adjusting the terms, one of these 5 terms, one or all of the 5 terms in a loan agreement. So a debt restructuring can either involve extending the tenure of a loan. Instead of repaying a loan in 2 years, you agree with your creditors to pay it in 3 years. So it might involve that. Or it might involve reducing the installments that you are paying so that you can pay them over a longer period of time. Remember that reducing the installments does not automatically amount to an extension of the tenure of a loan, because you can reduce installments, some installments, and then move most of the payments towards the end of the loan. So maybe you are making a payment of $10,000 per month. You say, no, we can only afford $8,000 for the first year. But then when we move to the second year, instead of paying the $10,000 that we were paying, we are now going to be paying the $12,000, which means the $2,000 that you have cut out in the first year, you've added it in the second year of your loan agreement. So there are those kinds of modifications. The bottom line that I'm driving at here is that each loan is unique. And when you talk about restructuring a loan, you would have to restructure each and every loan agreement that we have as a nation with external parties. And like I indicated earlier, there are more than 100 loan agreements that would have to be individually negotiated and individually restructured. Others, there will be a change in the interest rate, maybe others, there will be a change in the tenure, maybe others, there will be a change in the installment amounts, maybe others, there will be a change in the installment structure in terms of how much you pay on a monthly basis, or whether you're going to get a loan holiday where you stay maybe 6 months or a year without paying anything, and then everything is moved towards the end of the loan. So each loan, the bottom line is that each loan is unique, and each loan needs to be negotiated, and the terms of each loan need to be agreed. That having been said, the bottom line here, countrymen and women, is that the debt restructuring agreement that was reached in Paris and signed is merely a framework which spells out the principles under which debt restructuring is going to be undertaken. It is not, how do I put it? It does not affect any particular loan agreement, because no loan agreement has yet been negotiated and restructured. And if you ask me, of course, the framework agreement that was reached in Paris is an important step in a way. But if you really analyze the issue, you realize that given the huge difference in the appetite to restructure loans by different stakeholders, it wouldn't really be a wise idea to negotiate all our loans under a common framework, under the same principles. Because, when you look at our external debt, so you find that some of our external debt is with sovereign countries, with sovereign nations. Maybe we owe the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia $300 million. Maybe we owe the United Kingdom $200 million. maybe we owe France $400 million. So these are loans with the sovereign nations. And then we have certain types of loans with multilateral institutions. So you find that maybe we owe $2 billion to the World Bank, maybe we owe $1.3 billion to the International Monetary Fund, maybe we owe $500 million to the Africa Development Bank. So these are multilateral institutions. And then there are certain loans which we owe to commercial entities. Now, these commercial entities can either be banks, it can either be mutual funds, it can either be external insurance companies, and so forth and so on. An example of a loan to a commercial entity is the Eurobond. So the Eurobond is a loan which we obtained from a consortium of European financial institutions, including banks. Now, my point is that the appetite, for instance, for a commercial institution to negotiate, to restructure a debt, to reduce the interest rate, for instance, is usually very low because these commercial entities have to report to shareholders and they are in the business of making profit. You understand? So the appetite of the Eurobond holders to negotiate the Eurobond is actually very, very low compared to the appetite of a sovereign creditor like a nation, like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or like the United Kingdom, or like China, to actually negotiate and restructure a loan. Sovereign nations tend to be more receptive to actually restructure loans of countries, underdeveloped countries like Zambia, because they tend to carry that moral guilt on them, that people are going to look at them and say, you are refusing to assist a country which is struggling, which is on its knees. You are hesitating to assist it. So they have that moral guilt. And oftentimes, sovereign debt is usually easier to restructure and even obtain total debt cancellation. If you remember what happened with the HIPC, those who have a good memory or those who were there at that time, HIPC stood for the highly indebted poor countries, and Zambia registered under that HIPC initiative. And when you look at the debt which we owed, that's $7 billion plus in the late 90s, almost 99% of that debt was owed to sovereign nations. So it was easier under the HIPC initiative to actually obtain total debt cancellation because it was owed to a sovereign nation. You fast forward to the current position where we are, where we owe a total of $14.3 billion or so, you'll find that a good portion of our debt is actually owed to commercial entities as well as multilateral institutions. And so from our standpoint, it would have been very nice if the multilateral institutions which are initiating this debt restructuring program were in the forefront actually restructuring the debt that we owe to them. And most notable among these multilateral institutions is the International Monetary Fund itself, as well as its sister organization, the World Bank. We owe the World Bank, I think, in excess of $4 billion. And we owe the International Monetary Fund in excess of about $1.4 billion. So you're talking about a total of about, close to $6 billion that Zambia owes to these Brentwood institutions. And so it would have set a very good tone if these Brentwood institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were in the forefront actually restructuring the debt and not just coming up with a common framework under which the debt can be restructured. So like I said earlier, the debt restructuring agreement, the common framework agreement that was signed by the president yesterday can actually disadvantage us and will potentially disadvantage us when it comes to negotiating debt with sovereign nations. It will benefit us when it comes to negotiating debt with commercial entities like the Eurobond. But when it comes to sovereign nations and to some extent multilateral institutions, because when you look at multilateral institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, you'll find that it is made up of sovereign nations. It is actually countries that make up these multilateral institutions. So the only benefit we are likely to get from the debt restructuring agreement that was signed yesterday is when it comes to Zambia negotiating debt restructuring for loans that we obtained from commercial entities such as the Eurobond. And so if you ask me, and if I was president of this republic, I would have chosen not to go the route of a debt restructuring agreement under the common framework of the G20 countries. The reason is simple. It would have been more beneficial and it would have yielded more benefit to Zambia if the president had engaged each of our creditors individually. So if the president could have a meeting with the Eurobond holders and negotiate the Eurobond specifically, it would yield better results. Similarly, if the president could go to China and negotiate the debt that we have with China individually, it would yield better results. Similarly, if the president could go to the World Bank and negotiate the $4 billion plus that we owe to the World Bank individually, it would yield better results, as opposed to putting all our creditors in one pot and coming up with a so-called common framework for debt restructuring, which are the rules that are going to be employed in negotiating with all our creditors. Of course, there has been some argument by some of our creditors to say that all creditors need to be treated equally. But that is theoretical. Not all creditors are the same. Even at an individual level, when you owe money to people, if you owe money to a bank, it's not the same as if you owe money to Zamcash. If you owe money to Zamcash, they will even come to your house. You are eating supper with your family. They will knock at the door and join you at the table and tell you that, Mr. Mulenga, we want our 1,500 kwacha, which you borrowed from Zamcash. So it's different. It's different. The appetite to pursue a debt is higher among certain creditors and it is lower among other creditors. Similarly, when you talk about negotiating the terms of a particular loan, you'll find that some creditors would just forgive you the loan. I'm sure a number of you have borrowed money at an individual level, and then you take the money you had borrowed to the person who had given you the money, maybe 300 or 400 kwacha, and the person says, no, it's fine. Just keep that 300 kwacha. It's okay. I don't mind. I just assisted you. And yet, when you went to him or her to borrow, you said you pay back. And they said, okay, fine, you pay back. But when you take back the money, they say, no, it's fine. I don't want that money. Just keep it. I was assisting you with the problem that you had. So the bottom line, countrymen and women, is that the appetite to recover a particular loan is different among different individual creditors. And the idea which President Hakainde Hichilema, through the IMF, of course, developed, that it would be a better idea to come up with a common debt restructuring framework, which they are calling the G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring. It would yield better results for Zambia. I personally do not agree with that approach. I think it is a very bad approach, and I strongly believe that there is nothing that is there to celebrate about the common debt restructuring framework agreement that was signed by President Hakainde Hichilema in Paris yesterday. We are shooting ourselves in the foot. It is a question of lack of innovation and perhaps to some extent laziness. Because, like I said, we have more than 100 different loan agreements with different creditors. So when you go and engage each one of these creditors, some people might feel that that is a lot of work, that it is too much work. And they would want to make a shortcut where they come up with common rules which are going to be applicable in terms of debt restructuring among all our, 100+ creditors whom we owe money as a nation. But it is such a bad idea, because even the person who wanted to say, isunga nifye mpia yo, tatuleifaya 300 kwacha yenu mwatuletera atimuleweshe nkongore. That person, because they are being subjected to this common framework, they will be compelled to actually get those repayments, to get that money, which under different circumstances, had you approached them individually, they would have simply forgiven you that debt. So that is the downside of this so-called G20 common framework for debt restructuring, which President Hakainde Hichilema just signed. Now, let me address a second issue about this debt restructuring, which is the issue of the excitement that is there. I've seen excitement from the president himself. I've seen excitement from the ministers. I've seen excitement from UPND members. I've seen excitement from some diplomats, specifically the UK ambassador to Zambia. I've seen excitement from the Swedish ambassador to Zambia. And countrymen and women, personally, I think there's nothing to be excited about. There is nothing to celebrate. The reason I say that, you should look at the narrative that some people are trying to argue, including the British High Commissioner to Zambia, where and also the Swedish ambassador to Zambia, where they are arguing that this G20 common framework debt restructuring agreement is going to free up resources for Zambia to apply in other needy areas, including health, education, and so on and so forth. My submission, countrymen and women, is that only a person who does not fully understand Zambia's financial standing today would make such a statement. The reason is simple. When you look at our external debt, we put a moratorium on repayment of our external debt since the times that the Patriotic Front were in office. That was sometime in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. 2019, we put a moratorium. We decided to default. I'm sure all of you remember that. So we stopped making any repayments on our external debt from that time. That is around 2019. And countrymen and women, this is 2023. So you are talking about 4 years of us as a nation not repaying any of our loans. Whether the installment is due or not, we simply ignore it. We haven't been paying. And based on the agreement that was reached with the International Monetary Fund, what it is that Zambia committed itself that once a debt restructuring agreement is agreed upon and the various debts have been restructured, then we are going to immediately begin to repay these loans that we owe. So we have been on a repayment break for 4 years. And now that the restructuring agreement has been reached, and hopefully the individual loans are going to be restructured in the next couple of months, then what will happen is that we are going to begin to pay our loans, all our loans. We are going to begin to, resume making payments. So the question then from a cash flow point of view is, if when we were, on a break from paying any loans, the 4 years break that we've had, we haven't seen any, improvement in the financial health of the country. As we speak right now, council workers across the country, including Lusaka City Council, are going for months without a salary, simply because the central government is not able to release the local government equalization fund. As you are aware, government in the budget puts aside a significant amount of money, more than 10 billion kwacha, which it is supposed to release to the various councils to support these councils so that they can be able to operate and even pay salaries. You understand? So at the time that we were not making any debt repayments, we were on a break. Government was failing to release the local government equalization fund to the various councils across the country. And these councils, some of them have gone for 10 months, others 15 months, others 20 months without paying salaries because the central government, the Ministry of Finance, was not releasing that money because they didn't have that money to release to these councils, among other things. You understand? Now, if that was the situation when we were not paying our loans, then where is the money going to come from now that going forward we are going to begin to start paying our loans? That's the question. Where is that money which the Swedish ambassador is talking about to say it will free up resources to dedicate to health and education and so on and so forth? Where is that money going to come from? Because from a cash flow point of view, we need more money now that we've resumed making payments on our loans. We need more money to pay those loans, which means what is likely to happen going forward, now that this debt restructuring agreement has been reached and we're going to resume repaying our loans, is that government might even struggle to pay salaries of civil servants. Because whatever money is there, we are not going to only talk about our own consumption here in Zambia as a country, but we are going to talk about allocating some resources to repay the loans which we had stopped paying since 2019, when the Patriotic Front government put a moratorium on loan repayments. And then the new Dawn administration, when they took over on the 24th of August 2021, I thought that President Hakainde Hichilema will lift that moratorium and begin to pay off our external debt. But I was shocked when I realized that the president had decided to maintain the moratorium on payment of external debt. And so we have not been paying for the past 4 years, 2 years under PF and 2 years under the UPND administration. So I want to put it very clearly, countrymen and women, that the celebrations which are out there among certain stakeholders, that now that we have reached a G20 common framework for loan restructuring agreement in Paris, then government is going to free up resources which can then be channeled to other sectors. That is a misconception. Such a narrative can only be peddled by people who either don't understand what they're talking about or people who have a hidden agenda to try and portray government is doing very well when in fact it is not. Government, from a financial point of view, financial management, government is by far not doing well. And the other issue, countrymen and women, is that when you look at us as a nation, in terms of our main sources of income, we rely mainly on tax revenue from the mining sector. That is the backbone of our fiscal position as a nation. And when you look at the money we were collecting in taxes from the mines, whether you are looking at corporate tax, or you are looking at mineral royalty tax, or you are looking at withholding tax from the mines, each of those categories of taxation were far much higher in 2019 compared to what the figures are today. Essentially because of the tax holidays that the UPND administration has given to the mines under the argument that it will encourage them to increase production with the aim of reaching 3 million metric tons in 5 years. So far, there hasn't been an increment even of a single 1,000 tons of copper ever since those loan holidays were given, those tax holidays were given to the mines. So there hasn't been any benefit to us. But when you look at the figures, And I want you to pay attention to the publication which was made by the Bank of Zambia in their second quarter monetary policy committee meeting, where they showed a graph of tax revenues before the tax holidays were given to the mines and what the tax revenues are now. As we are speaking now, our collections in tax revenue on a monthly basis for some tax types, like mineral royalty tax, have fallen from as high as $380 million in 2019 to $65 million in 2023. So now, when you look at the drop in revenue from about $380 million in 2019 to $65 million in 2023, that is a huge drop, a very big drop. Now, the question that I have for you as well as for government is, if government was struggling to pay these loans, this external debt, to service this external debt in 2019, when our tax revenue from the mines was very high, was reasonably high. Let me not use the word very high. Maybe it might not be the correct way to use. When our tax revenue collection from the mines was reasonably high, the government at that time was failing to service our external debt. Now you fast forward to 2023, and our tax revenue from the mining sector has dwindled by more than 70%. How is government going to be able to begin to service our external debt with our low income in terms of tax revenue from the mines? How are we going to achieve that? That, countrymen and women, is near to impossible. This so-called debt restructuring agreement might look attractive when it is being marketed by President Hakainde Hichilema, when it is being talked about by ministers, by people who support the UPND, but the reality is that it is going to bring more hardship to this country than before we signed this debt restructuring agreement. It will bring more hardship to this country because government does not have the revenue to service this external debt. And the reason we don't have the revenue is because we gave these mining companies tax holidays, which reduced the amount of tax that we collect. And, the other issue, countrymen and women, is the lack of credibility among state institutions, including the Zambia Revenue Authority. The Zambia Revenue Authority is in the habit of cooking figures which it publishes in order to give a false picture that it is able to achieve its targets, its revenue targets, when in reality, it is very far from achieving its revenue targets. And, when Zambia Revenue Authority collects money, when it collects tax, let's say from the mines, that tax is paid to the Bank of Zambia. So the question, or rather the challenge I have for the Zambia Revenue Authority is, how come their figures are different from the figures that are published by the Bank of Zambia in terms of the money that Bank of Zambia actually receives in terms of tax revenue from the mines? When ZRA publishes its figures, it sensationalizes those figures and exaggerates those figures. But when the Bank of Zambia publishes its figures in terms of the money it has received in tax revenue, it is a fraction of what ZRA had reported. So there is a big fundamental problem in the new Dawn administration. Most of the state entities, the state institutions under the new Dawn do not have credibility. They lack integrity. So even when they say something, even when they publish something, whatever they say or whatever they publish is most of the time questionable. And you cannot rely on it without you reviewing it and critiquing it and, ensuring that the information that they have released is credible information, which is not supposed to be the case. When a government institution releases information or issues a statement, That statement is supposed to be credible. It is supposed to have integrity. It is supposed to be reliable. That is what gives credibility to the entire government. That is what gives credibility to the president himself. Without the institutions that make up government being credible, then it is difficult for the Republican president to be credible, to have credibility. So that is one of the biggest challenges that the new Donald administration has. Most of these institutions lack credibility. They like to sensationalize things. They like to make the government look better than it really is, make the government appear as if it is performing better than it really is, by distorting the figures, by distorting the statistics that they actually report, which is totally regrettable. Because you must remember, countrymen and women, we are in this thing together. We are all citizens of the Republic of Zambia. And if Zambia has problems which require to be resolved, we need to put our heads together and try to resolve those problems. So how are we going to put our heads together and try to resolve the problems which the country is facing if we are being given distorted information, if we are being given fake information, if we are being given a false picture in terms of what the financial situation of this country really is? It is only when the symptoms are too big to hide that government feels ashamed and admits to the problems, the financial problems that this country is facing. It is only when council workers decide to stop going for work and we see statements by the Minister of Local Government and so on and so forth, threatening council workers to report for work despite them not getting a salary. That's when we are alerted to the fact that, so you haven't been paying council workers their salaries. Why are you failing to remit the local government equalization fund to the local authorities so that they can add to the revenue they generate and pay salaries? And again, countrymen and women, although we are talking about the issue of debt restructuring, I think you allow me to digress a little bit and talk about the issue of local authorities and their failure to sustain themselves even under the new Dawn administration. Because one of the things that President Hakainde Hichilema tried to sell to the Zambian people during the campaigns in the run-up to the 2021 general election is that he is competent. It is that he is a capable person, that he has a financial background, that he is going to introduce efficiency and effectiveness in the running of local authorities so that local authorities will be able to generate sufficient income. He is going to stop corruption that happens in these local authorities. He is going to stop theft of resources and ensure that these local authorities are able to run sustainably. But countrymen and women, it's been almost 2 years now since President Hakainde Hichilema took over office, and we have clearly seen for ourselves with our own two eyes that he has failed to run the local authorities. He has failed to introduce the reforms which are necessary to stop corruption, which brings about revenue leakages in these local authorities. He has failed to introduce efficiency in these local authorities so that they can be able to operate, in a financially sustainable manner. He has failed to do that. There's nothing on the table. As we speak right now, the local authorities are being faced with the same challenges that they were being faced with under the previous Patriotic Front government. So where is the competency that President Hakainde Hichilema was saying he's going to introduce when he becomes president? Where is the reforms in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency in the management of these local authorities? Because countrymen and women, if you ask me as a chartered accountant and as an auditor, I'll tell you that from the face of it, it does not make sense that a council such as the Lusaka City Council, with its various sources of income, can be failing to pay salaries of its workers unless there is pilferage of resources, unless there is serious corruption, unless there is serious revenue leakages. Because when you drive around Lusaka, I'm sure most of you see all those billboards A lot of billboards, both big and small. Every corner of Lusaka you go to, they are advertising billboards. Those billboards pay a lot of money to the council. And when I say a lot of money, I've pressed billboards for my company myself. And they will charge you as much as 10,000 kwacha per day for a big billboard in a busy road like Greatest Road. You are talking about 300,000 kwacha per month. That's a lot of money. And for small billboards, they'll charge you maybe 1,500 kwacha per day, a small 240 by 120 centimeter billboard. 1.5 you multiply by 30 days, that's 45,000 kwacha. You multiply by 12 months, and they are always billboards in the roads. So just from my own assessment, based on the fact that, I'm an experienced accountant, the Lusaka City Council is supposed to generate enough money just from the billboards before we talk about anything else, before we talk about any other revenue stream that the council has. They are supposed to generate enough money just from billboard advertising to pay salaries and be able to meet all their other operational needs. If anything, the Lusaka City Council is supposed to be remitting some money on a monthly basis to the central government, to the Ministry of Finance, and say, we have a surplus and here you are, so that you can use this money to support the budget and meet the other needs that the country has. But that is not the case. Apart from billboards advertising, the Lusaka City Council collects personal levy. Personal levy, countrymen and women, is paid by each and every worker. Now you tell me, how many workers are in Lusaka? You are talking about millions of people who are working and where the council collects personal levy. And that is often paid as a lump sum at the beginning of the year. You understand? So from personal levy alone, it's a lot of money. Where does all that money go? Apart from personal levy, the Lusaka City Council collects rates. And rates, the rates are very high in Lusaka. You'll find that a small house, a 3-bedroomed house, which I have for my mother in Abondale there, we pay rates of about 3,000 kwacha every 6 months. That's about 6,000 kwacha per year. Now that is a small 3-bedroomed house. What about all these shopping malls in Lusaka? What about all these tall buildings in Lusaka? So just from the rates, based on my calculation, just from the rates, the Lusaka City Council is supposed to generate enough money to meet their salary obligations and so on and so forth. And then you've got all sorts of other revenue streams. When you go and bury someone at Roper's Hill there, you need to pay. All that money is money in the coffers of Lusaka City Council. When you park your vehicle in town there, they charge you 5 kwacha. All that is money in the coffers of the Lusaka City Council. So how is it possible, under the so-called competent President Hakainde Hichilema, that the Lusaka City Council is failing to pay salaries for its employees? Not failing 1 month, not failing 2 months, not failing 3 months, but failing 6 months. For some workers, 10 months. How is that possible? So that can only be possible if there is leakage of revenue by people who are affiliated to the president, people who belong to the UPND party. They simply took over the stealing of money which was done by the PF cadres under the previous administration. They have simply inherited that rotten system, and they've simply embraced that rotten system where there is continuous theft of public funds, to the extent that very little actually reaches the Lusaka City Council bank accounts. So the question then becomes, what reforms has President Hakainde Hichilema introduced? How is his government different from the previous government? Those are the questions, countrymen and women, which you are supposed to be asking yourselves. You're supposed to be asking your friends. You're supposed to be asking your family members, because we need to change this country. We need to make Zambia a better place. We have all the potential that any country can ask for. All that is needed is to actually convert that potential into actual prosperity for this country. And for me, I've always submitted to say, look, what needs to be done is not very complicated. You just need someone who has credibility, someone who loves this country more than they love themselves, someone who has actual competence. actual competence, not a person who claims that they are an economist, and you wonder whether they did home economics or who really taught them economics at UNZA, because everything they implement doesn't make sense. Everything they implement doesn't make sense. There is fluctuation and volatility in the entire economy. And, you know, when you attend any business school, the first thing they will tell you in an economics class is that you have to achieve stability for the economy to grow. You cannot grow your economy if the economic parameters are fluctuating. Whether those economic parameters are the exchange rate or it is the price of a key production input like fuel, the moment you have those monthly fluctuations, the moment you have an exchange rate, yesterday it was 15 kwacha, today it is 17.5, tomorrow it is 20. The moment you have those fluctuations, it means you can't grow the economy. And any decent economist is supposed to know that. So the question then becomes, what kind of economist is President Hakainde Hichilema? And where did he learn his economics? Because his economics, countrymen and women, does not make sense. It doesn't make sense whatsoever. Even his decisions don't make sense. This signing of the so-called G20 Common Framework Debt Restructuring Agreement in Paris, France yesterday doesn't make sense. Just like his fluctuating exchange rate doesn't make sense. Just like his monthly reviews of fuel prices don't make sense. Nothing that President Hakainde Hichilema does in terms of economic management makes sense. Nothing whatsoever. Just like the tax holidays that he gave to the mining companies don't make sense. Nothing ever makes sense. Nothing makes sense. So you wonder whether the president is inherently incompetent or he is under the influence of some external forces. You wonder. I don't know. I can't tell. I'll leave that question to you. Maybe you can pay attention and try to figure it out. Is the president inherently incompetent or he's under the influence of some external force somewhere? Why is it that he makes senseless decisions? Every time he makes an economic decision, it is a senseless decision. When you look at the accountability of that money, the 65 million which was recovered from Madam Faith Musonda, the explanation doesn't make sense. The president himself, in his statement, said that the Auditor General's management letter is fake. But we saw that the ministers are referring to that management letter, which means they are implying that it is original. We saw news diggers stand by their position to say this management letter from the Auditor General is a genuine document. And we have seen that they have not arrested the news diggers editor. If that document was fake, then he would have been arrested for faking a document. But we have seen that he hasn't been arrested, which means the document is genuine. And yet, the president himself, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, made a statement that the management letter that the Auditor General's office issued to the Anti-Corruption Commission was a fake document. So where did he, how did he come up with that conclusion, that that document was fake? And why is he defending the disappearance of the 65 million personally? Why is he personally defending the disappearance of that money? Why is he often defending wrongdoing? Those countrymen and women are the questions you need to answer. They are the questions you need to answer because Hakainde Hichilema is your president. You are the ones who went, you woke up early in the morning, you went and voted him into office. He is your president. So you must answer the senseless acts, the senseless decisions that he makes. Not once, not twice, but on a continuous basis. A president can make one mistake once in a while. That's understood. Even me, when I become your president in 2026, God willing, with your grace, I'll occasionally make a mistake. But I will not be continuously making mistakes. One mistake in a year is okay, but multiple mistakes in a week is totally not acceptable. It means that you have a wrong person in that position, in that seat. You have a totally wrong person. And you need to begin to question the president, you, the citizens, not us, the politicians. Because when we question him, people will say, no, Sean Tembo, wafuna wakankalepo pampando paja. That's why every day wakamba chabe pali bali, waona mo chabe voi pamuri bali, because ujampando Sean Tembo so magona, wafuna wakankalepo, ndiyo problem imankalapo. So you, the citizens, you need to begin to question the senseless decisions of your president. Mukazimufunsa kuti iwe bali, kushe ma decision ayaupanga, umaganiza bwanji, aya ma tax holiday amene upasa wantu, nikuganiza kwa bwanji, mukazimufunsa. Iyi exchange rate amene ivina monga ni nyao, ivina pamwamba pansi, nikuganiza kwa bwanji. Ask your president. Maybe when you, the citizens, you ask your president, he might provide better answers to you. Because for some of us, we've totally given up on President Hakainde Hichilema. He is not taking us anywhere. He is not taking this country anywhere. He has a habit of celebrating mediocrity. And any person who has a habit of celebrating mediocrity, such as this so-called G20 Common Framework Debt Restructuring Agreement, it means that they don't have higher aspirations. They don't have a vision. That is why they are in the business of celebrating mediocrity. So President Hakainde Hichilema has the habit of celebrating mediocrity, and even in this case, he is celebrating mediocrity by celebrating this so-called G20 Debt Restructuring Common Framework Agreement. Countrymen and women, thank you for your time. It has been a pleasure being with you, and we shall engage again in the near future. Very soon we shall resume our weekly engagements as soon as we put a few things in place. But for now, I beg of you to reflect on the issues that we've spoken about. We've spoken about a number of issues. We've spoken about the problems at the local authorities, the problems at the Lusaka City Council, and the fact that these local authorities are supposed not to have these problems. They are supposed to be self-sufficient. So if they are not self-sufficient, then who is stealing the money? Nindani wamena kudya ndalama? Those are the questions which you, the citizens, must ask yourselves. Mukankhala mnyumba mweka mwazifunsa. Kusha mavuto yametiona why yashitika so? Nishi president wametina ikapo Enzo Krema kuti ari competent. Kusha ari competent zona oro sazi wavamena achita. Kusha economics yamena kambata anaverenga paunza. Kusha ni economics yazona yola nyingira chuma chachalo oro ni home economics yopika kandolo na nshawa. Mukazimfunsa naye mwazifunsa mweka na eve president wanu mwamufunsa. Because what we are seeing, countrymen and women, we are not going anywhere. We have all the potential. We have the means to develop this country, to reduce the poverty levels, to make people live a better life, but we are not making progress. So you need to begin to ask yourselves those questions, and you need to begin to ask your president those questions. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.